Hello, and welcome to another talk in Christian Evidences, or Christian Apologetics. The title of my talk today is on How on Earth Did Jesus Become a God? That title may throw you off a little bit, so let me say a few things about that. First of all, it's not original with me. The title actually comes from a book by Larry Hurtado. Very good book, an excellent little book, and I recommend it highly to you. I'm going to be talking about some of the stuff that he talks about in that book in my title here. The point is, I'm not trying to say, by the way, that I believe that Jesus became a God. I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I take the Orthodox Christian view that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity who has always been God, even before his incarnation here on earth. But the purpose of the title is to point out a particular problem for many of the critics or scholars today out there who do not agree with the Orthodox view of Christianity, who agree that Jesus was just a human being here on earth. There's a problem, and we'll see that problem as we proceed through it. One of the unique things about Christianity is that we proclaim that Jesus Christ is himself God, that Christ made the claim to be God. That's very unique amongst major religions of the world. If you look at the different religions of the world, they don't have that aspect. For example, Hinduism, there is no one person who claims to be God, and their concept of God is an impersonal force rather than a personal being anyway. Buddha, well, he claimed that there were many ways to God, but he never claimed to be a way himself or claimed to be God himself. Some of his followers later tried to make that claim about him, but Buddha never made the claim to be God. Muhammad, of course, said there was only one God, Allah. Muhammad never claimed to be God. As a matter of fact, if you were to try to make Muhammad God, he would probably violently react against you on that point. Of course, we know in Judaism there were many prophets of God, Moses and Elijah, but none of them actually claimed to be God themselves. But when you get to Christianity, we have this figure, Jesus, who claimed to be God, and who many Christians, in fact, believe, in fact, he was God. That's a unique thing about Christianity. And yet it is this very unique aspect of Christianity that is denied by many of the modern scholars and critics today. Now, I can't talk about all the different views out there, but let me take an example, one representative view, a very popular view. I want to take the view of John Dominic Crossan. His view is very well known, and it's very commonly accepted, and many scholars adopt it in some form or another. They don't maybe adopt every variety or every aspect of his view. What does Crossan say about Jesus? Well, Crossan basically considered Jesus to be a peasant Jewish cynic. Let me explain that real quickly. By peasant, we're talking about his economic status. He was very poor. Okay, Crossan actually believes that he was a poor farmer. Okay, by saying he was Jewish, of course, we mean he was a person who lived during the Second Temple period of Judaism, when there were Pharisees and Sadducees going on. And by calling him a cynic, Crossan wants to specifically identify him with a group of philosophers, ancient philosophers, that were known for being very critical of society. They were kind of loners, they wandered around, they were lovers of nature, they didn't live in social frameworks, and they were very, very critical of society. Crossan believes that Jesus' main mission was basically a political mission. Okay, he was against the oppression that was going on of the poor people of Israel by the rich and powerful of that particular nation and by the Romans that were going on. And so his basic mission was to go around and to preach against this oppression, to preach a society, a kingdom in which there was more equal treatment of others. And he demonstrated that through the sharing of common meals and the offering of free healings and these kinds of things. Eventually, of course, he came up against the power of Rome, and Rome became threatened by what Jesus was saying, claiming that he had another kingdom. And so Rome came in, and Rome, of course, killed Jesus and scattered his followers, and that was basically the end of Jesus and his movement. That's basically Crossan's position. That position is very popular in some variety or another amongst many scholars, that basic idea behind Jesus. However, there's a problem with that particular position, okay? And the problem is that within a few short decades, and actually I hope to show you even a shorter period of time than decades, okay, those closest to Jesus came to venerate him, to worship him as divine, granting to him the same status and honor that was normally reserved for God alone. In short, the question is this: if Crossan and others who agree with Crossan are right, then the church was wrong. And the question is, how did the church, the early believers, get it so wrong if that's not what Jesus really was here? Well, there are many theories as to how this occurred, and we can't look at all of them. We don't have time. But we will look at the most popular view, I think, that's out there. It's called the evolutionary view. And this view basically claims that the idea of Jesus was divine, slowly evolved over a period of many years between the time of his death and the time when, of course, the gospel accounts were really written down, which most of these scholars will date very late, 80s, 90s, into the hundreds even. They'll date when the scholars were written down there. Okay, there's different ideas of how how the idea evolved that Jesus was divine. We've already mentioned in earlier talks about form criticism, the Bultmannian concept, that as the oral stories of Jesus were passed down, they were elaborated upon by different communities according to their needs. For example, this community had a particular problem with disease in the community. They talked about Jesus as a divine healer and would elaborate miracles, things and such along those lines with him. And as these stories got more elaborated upon, more and more was thrust upon Jesus, and eventually he came out looking like a god. That's the form critical idea. Okay. Another theory that became very popular was a theory that was proposed by a scholar by the name of Wilhelm Bucer, okay, who was part of a movement known as the History of Religions School that occurred in Germany around the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. Basically, Bucer's idea is as Christianity spread away from Palestine into the rest of the Mediterranean world, it became more of a Gentile church and adopted aspects of the pagan religions that it found around the rest of the Mediterranean world. One of the most important aspects was the idea of the apotheosis. Okay, an apotheosis was the idea of a human becoming a god or reaching a divine status. You might remember from your history that Julius Caesar at one point declared himself as divine. That was the idea of the apotheosis, and this was not necessarily uncommon in the Mediterranean world at the time here. Well, there's a number of serious problems with this particular evolutionary theory, and it is the most popular theory of how Jesus eventually ended up being worshipped by the church here. The major problem, the biggest problem I think with it, is simply a chronology problem. This worship of Jesus as God occurs very early in the development of the church, extremely early in the development of the church, much earlier than the 80s or 90s that these scholars often want to give it. In fact, it's so early that any evolutionary development is really rendered invalid as a historical explanation for why the church would do this. Our earliest written sources that we have, of course, about Jesus are the letters of Paul that he wrote, his epistles that we have here, that were written from probably the late 40s throughout the 50s. We're scarcely 20 years now from the death of Christ. And the amazing thing about these letters is they don't only teach that Jesus Christ was God, they actually presuppose devotion and worship to Christ as God. This wasn't the invention of Paul. Paul talks about it as it's already there. It's already in practice in the early church. So we're talking that within 20 years of the death of the Christ, the church has already been practicing a devotion and to worship as God at this particular point here. And I'm not so much talking about the doctrinal teachings, although that's certainly part of it, as much as I want to talk about the devotional practices of the church, singing hymns to Christ, praying in his name, and actually praying to Christ. These are things that are normally only given to God. There's numerous examples throughout Scripture. I can't go through all of them in the time that we have here, but one example might be found in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. Scholars are agreed that Paul is actually quoting here an early Christian hymn that was used in corporate worship in the early church and composed many years earlier than Paul's letter to the Philippians. It speaks of Jesus as being in the form of God and equal to God. And proclaims that every knee should bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. Interestingly, this last part is almost a direct quotation of Isaiah 45, verses 22 and 23, in which God reserves that bowing for himself alone. This is what Isaiah says. God speaking, "Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. I have sworn by myself, the word has gone forth from my mouth in righteousness and will not turn back, that to me every knee will bow and every tongue will swear allegiance." Now notice that. Paul's quoting a Christian hymn in which Christians are saying that is true of Jesus. They are equating Jesus with God at that particular point. That's very, very early in the history of the church. Not much later that they're exalting him to this high status. In fact, as we look at the history of Paul, his early persecution of the church and his later conversion, okay, all of that can be attributed to this early devotion to Jesus. That's probably why Paul was persecuting the church. Many scholars see strong evidence in that direction there. Okay, this devotion to Jesus as a God. Okay, and this event of Paul's persecution and conversion is very early to the death of Christ. A second problem for the evolutionary view has to do with where this worship of Jesus developed. Among Jewish believers who had a highly exclusivistic view of monotheism, there is only one God for these Jewish believers. The worship of Jesus as God is truly remarkable, and it's without any real analogy anywhere else in history. It is true that in the Mediterranean world of Roman times, the idea of multiple deities was fairly common, the apotheosis we talked about, and it was no problem to simply add another deity into the mix for the Romans. However, this is not true of the Palestinian Jews of the Second Temple period. They had a fierce reputation throughout the Roman period for being exclusively monotheistic. One must remember that this worship of Jesus as divine arose out of a Jewish sect. There was no Christian church in the beginning. They weren't thinking about forming a church or a whole new Christian religion at the beginning of the early what we call early church history. They were just a Jewish sect that believed that Jesus was God. That is what's so remarkable, and it comprised the single most notable feature of the early church. In fact, the fact that the Christians were persecuted by both Jews and Romans for their preaching this exclusivity of God and Jesus being God. A third problem with the evolutionary view is that there simply is no analogy in ancient religions to what we have here. The early devotion to Jesus arising in a monotheistic context is nothing like the apotheosis of other pagan religions. First, the early church abhorred the idea of multiple deity practice of pagan religions, and they remained firmly monotheistic. For example, Corinth was a hotbed of pagan worship of multiple deities. Yet in Paul's letter to the Corinthians in chapter 8, he condemns worshiping other gods and commends the worship of the, quote, one God, the Father from whom all things are all things, and we exist for him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ. Second, the view of the relationship of Jesus and the Father is nothing like the apotheosis of pagan religions. The apotheosis was basically the idea of a human who basically was elevated to godlike status because of some great exceptional merit on his part, and was considered a god in his own right. But the early Christians went to great extents to avoid any hint of that idea of polytheism or ditheism or more than one God. Their model shows a father-son subordinate relationship that's best described as binitarian. One God eternally manifested in both Father and Son. Now, saying binitarian, I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring the Trinity, of course. I'm not. I believe strongly in the Trinity. I'm just talking about this relationship between God and Father, okay, which we might call binitarian. It's not two gods. That's not how the church has ever seen that, even in its earliest worship. It always believed there was only one God. He was just manifested as both Father and Son. That's unique among ancient religions, and it's completely disanalogous to the apotheosis model of pagan religions of the day. A third problem with using the apotheosis model, is there's simply no evidence of widespread pagan religious practice in first century Palestine from which these early believers could have been influenced by that at all. This is something that's completely unique to him. So the question is this: how do we historically explain this worship of Jesus as God occurring in the earliest days of the development of the church among Palestinian Jews who were fiercely monotheistic and totally cut off from any influence by pagan religions? None of the theories really seems to work, certainly not the evolutionary theory, which is the most popular and the most common theory for this. I would like to suggest that the best explanation is that these early Jewish believers must have had an encounter with an incredible religious revelatory event or experience that caused a major paradigm shift in their religious thinking and led them to worship Jesus as God. I believe the best place to look for that is the experience of the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a further talk. Before we do that, I have one other talk I want to talk about the most extreme view of this, where people actually believe that Jesus didn't exist at all, that he's just simply made up a fabrication based on other pagan religions. We'll talk about that later.